Hello everyone, my name is Adrian and welcome to my Monster Bash video. If you don't know what Monster Bash is, I will give you a short description. A few talented artists illustrated some cards with random monster details on them. If you want to join in on Monster Bash, you draw 7 cards out of this deck and you bash them together to create your own monster in your preferred medium. It could be illustration, digital sculpting, or in my case, clay sculpting. Enjoy! Alright, let's get into the building process for my submission. Here are the cards I pulled. I feel like I got incredibly lucky with my cards because they immediately clicked for me. The 2 hands made it very clear that my build would be an undead humanoid creature, and together with the crown this gave me some ideas for a creepy backstory. The eyes and the wrinkled textures also helped out a lot for what I wanted this creature to look like. The ring and the rat tail were a little bit more challenging, but in the end I managed to incorporate them. With these cards I came up with this as the design. An undead king possessed by some otherworldly entity with many eyes. And with this design I started my build. First thing, I printed out my cards to use for reference. I sketched out a couple of views of my design in the size I wanted this sculpture to be. I then spun some metal wire and added a small ball of aluminum foil to fill up the head. I used my drawing to mark the place where I will have to attach the arms, and I used some green stuff to keep it in place. Here again I used my reference drawing, this time to mark where the joints will be. To be sure both arms are the same, I just spin around the armature and mark the joints for the other arm. With these markings I can work on the pose. I did make some minor changes to the pose because sometimes what works on paper is not necessarily what works best in 3 dimensions. With the posing done, I bulked up the body with aluminum foil and the first layer of polymer clay. And now it was time for some actual sculpting. I always enjoy this part of the sculpt because it's super quick. By building up all the bone structures and muscles, you can really begin to see the direction this build is going in. Also, it's a lot of fun to do this rough sculpting, adding and removing clay without worrying too much about destroying precious work. For the head, I always start out by roughly sculpting the shape of the skull. Especially for undead, the shape of the skull is the most defining part of the head, so it is important to get it right. With most of the anatomy more or less done, I wanted to see what the eyes would look like. I didn't want to spend too much time working on the details, only to remove them when I would start working on the eyes. Also, this gave me the opportunity to see what the best placement for the eyes would be. The big eye in the center I made out of polymer clay, but for all the other eyes I made small spheres with green stuff that I left to cure. I have a small collection of parts like this because I always make them from leftover epoxy clay. Spheres for eyes, spikes for horns or teeth, anything you think might be useful. From here on out I started to refine the sculpt, starting with the head. I added clay where I figured there would be skin and changed the shape of the skull on parts where I thought it wasn't quite right. I added eyelids without eyes because I figured this creature's eyes rotted away and it's using all the other eyes now. I did this because I felt like it makes the creature extra creepy, but also to not create an extra focal point to the sculpture. Normally the face is the main focal point of a sculpture like this, but in this instance I felt like the big eye in the chest would be the more interesting one. After adding some eyebrows, I started working on the mouth. I pushed in some holes for the teeth and sculpted the shape of the gums. To create the parting line between the skin and the gums, I first gave him a nice mustache, which I blended up towards the rest of the skin. After this was baked, I added teeth using green stuff. And then began the long process of making all of the skin texture. This was an immense undertaking, but I couldn't be happier that I did this in the end. It really worked out amazing. When I was doing the face, I quickly realized that adding perpendicular lines to the ones I had already done really helped to create a realistic, wrinkled skin texture. Normally my projects take far more time than the 3 weeks I had for this project. This is because I tend to lose myself in the details, spending countless hours on them. Seeing I wanted this sculpt, including the video, to be done within these 3 weeks was a big challenge for me. I was worried I wouldn't be able to create something I could be proud of, or that I wouldn't be able to finish anything at all. This skin texture all over the sculpture was something that scared me at first because I wasn't sure if it would mean I wouldn't be able to finish in time. On top of that, I also started the Inktober challenge on my Instagram, which I didn't want to quit either. I think overall I had the feeling I bit off more than I could chew, but I decided to try and go for it anyway. I started to spend 1 hour sculpting each day after work, and this gave me the feeling I was making small steps of progress each day. I also started to focus on eating healthy and getting enough sleep, which honestly made a huge difference. I had a lot more energy, and my overall view on if I could make it became much more positive. For the Inktober challenge, I made sure I was 1 day ahead so that it didn't give me too much stress. All these measures gave me a lot of confidence that I could do this, not just for this project, but also for future ones. I always thought I wouldn't be able to upload on a regular schedule, but now I think this might not be impossible. But alright, enough talk about me, let's get back to the project. At this point, I baked the sculpt because I did not want to lose all this progress. All that remained was sculpting the hands and the accessories. The open hand was quite challenging since there was not a lot of space for an armature. I used some very thin brass wire that I looped around the existing armature and used super glue and green stuff to keep them in place. After bending the fingers in the right position, I thinned down some green stuff with isopropyl alcohol and coated them with this sticky stuff. This helps to keep them more or less in the shape I want, and it makes it easier to put on the polymer clay afterwards. The staff needed some thorns, and here my collection of leftover epoxy clay pieces came in handy again. I put them in place and used some polymer clay to blend them into the staff. One of the cards was a crown, and I decided to make it using styrene sheets. I cut off a strip that I bended into shape, and I had some trouble to glue it onto the head, so I gave this guy some awkward temporary braces. To create the runes on the crown, I sculpted this separately and let it cure partially. This makes sculpting the runes a lot easier because you're doing it on a flat surface, and greatly diminishes the risk of damaging the runes when sticking it to the crown. All the remaining pieces were cut out of styrene and superglued to the base of the crown. Cutting styrene is super easy. With a sharp hobby knife you can score the lines you want to cut, and then you can just break out the part you need without having to cut all the way through. All these pieces were glued to the rest of the crown, and I used some green stuff to create the smaller details. The final thing I sculpted were two cute tiny rats that would be placed on the king's shoulders. I made small armatures and used green stuff to sculpt them. Technically, they are not part of the monster, so maybe I'm cheating a little bit here. Let me know in the comments if you think it's okay to do it like this. And now, Painting. I started with a black primer and then I base coated all of the skin with a sickly green. I then airbrushed a very light orange from below. I wanted to create the effect of light coming from below, like lava or fire, and these two base coats really gave me a great starting point to create this effect. To really sell the glowing effect, I manually highlighted all the parts that would receive the most light. After that, I glazed everything with a bright orange, which gave the glow a very warm tint. For the green parts of the skin, I basically followed the same process, but with a green tint. To create a little more depth in the skin, I used washes on both the green parts of the skin and the orange. The texture really helps with this because the washes creep nicely into the lines. After these washes, I started base coating the other parts of the model, the crown, the bands around the arms, the reds and the eyes. While all these parts were drying, I started painting the orb on the staff. I wet blended the gradient from red to white, and with my thinnest brush I painted some scratches on it. To give the scratches some depth, I used a white paint and a dark red just next to it. As I said before, I wanted the eyes on the body to be the main focal point for this sculpture. Because of this, the color choice was very important. Since I painted the skin green and the glow coming from below is orange, the most contrasting color I could choose was purple. So this is what I did. I glazed the eyes completely, making them a little darker towards the edges. I then came back with white, making two highlights, one above, one below. After that, I glazed the lower highlights with orange. And now it was time to possibly mess up all of this work with the pupil. With my tiniest brush and a thin down black paint, I made the thinnest lines I could manage. By making multiple lines, I can slowly adjust the shape of the pupil instead of trying to get it right in one attempt. After that, I took a deep breath and continued on the rest of the remaining eyes. Finally, I used epoxy glue to attach the sculpture to a plinth and called it good. Also, I tried something new and came up with some lore for this sculpture. Enjoy!
Not many have lived to tell the tale of their encounter with the all-seeing Tyrant, in his past life known as the Great Wizard King of Salsaborenko. The few people who did survive speak of a rotting corpse, seemingly held aloft through some unknown forbidden magic. What is remaining of his body is riddled with piercing eyes, frantically looking around as if they are desperately looking for something. Whatever his goals or desires, rumors say that the former inhabitants of Salsaborenko are now waiting for the all-seeing Tyrant's command as skeletal warriors or other undead abominations.
was different. I hope you liked it. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like down below. Subscribe if you want to see more. Follow me on Instagram if you want to see more in progress pictures. I'll have the link in the description below. Be sure to check out the other people's submissions for this year's Monster Bash. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.